My husband went a secret trip with his mistress and her family. When they got back, I had already sold the house. Hi, welcome to my channel. This is my new story.
For 6 months, my husband said he was in Europe for a research program. While I stayed home guarding everything we'd built over 30 years, he was out with his mistress spending our money as if it were worthless. By the time he booked his return, I had already rearranged everything in a way he would never have guessed. And when he walked through that door, the life he thought was his was gone. If you found your way here, I'm glad you stayed. Tell me below, where in the world are you reading this from? Your city, your country? I want to know. Quick note before we dive in, this story weaves in fictional elements for educational and narrative purposes. Similarities to any names or locations are purely coincidental, but the lesson inside is one I genuinely hope stays with you. September in Charleston arrives like a slow exhale, the brutal summer heat finally breaking its grip, the jasmine still clinging to the air long after it has any right to, and the light shifting into that particular shade of pale gold that makes the whole city look like something out of a painting you can't quite name but know you've seen before. I was deadheading the roses along the east fence when my phone rang. It was Arthur, calling from Rome. I pulled off my gardening glove and answered on the third ring the way I always did. Not too eager, not too slow. 30 years of marriage teaches you the rhythms of a person, whether you want to learn them or not. "The greenhouse," he said without hello. "Don't forget to water the orchids. I had the irrigation timer adjusted before I left, but the settings might have drifted." I looked at the row of climbing Cecile Bruners I'd been working on, pale pink, almost white in the morning light. Trailing up the iron fence I'd sourced from a salvage yard in Savannah the summer of 2003. I planted them the year Daniel started middle school. They'd taken 3 seasons to really take hold. "I'll check them this afternoon," I said. "And the HOA payment is due by the 15th. Make sure it goes through this time last quarter. There was a processing delay, and I got a notice." I remember. "There's also a package coming from Oxford University Press. Just set it in my study." "All right." A pause. In the background, I could hear what sounded like a cafe, the gentle clatter of espresso cups' voices in Italian, something light and easy, playing from somewhere I couldn't place. Rome in September. I had never been to Rome. "Good," Arthur said. And that was all. After he hung up, I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand looking at the garden. 6 months. He had been gone for 6 months on what Whitmore University formally listed as an extended research fellowship, a position funded, according to Arthur, by a joint academic grant between the university and a European consortium, studying what he called the evolving pedagogical frameworks of post-digital humanities. I had stopped trying to understand what that meant sometime around the 3rd month. What I understood was the garden. I understood every inch of it. The antique brick pathway running from the south gate to the back terrace, I'd had it relaid in 2009 after a contractor used the wrong mortar, and the whole thing buckled in the first hard freeze. The wisteria arbor along the western wall, which I'd trained over 8 years into the shape I wanted. The cutting garden near the kitchen window, full now with the last of the summer dahlias and the first of the autumn asters. The kitchen herb beds, the heritage rose garden, the dwarf magnolia I'd planted in 2015 in memory of my mother, which had finally, this past spring, bloomed for the first time. I had built all of it, not in the abstract way people mean when they say they built something. I mean, I had drawn the plans, sourced the plants, turned the soil, laid the edging, and gotten on my knees in the Carolina clay more times than I could count. Arthur had never once picked up a trowel. He had, however, always referred to it as our garden when colleagues came for dinner. I set the pruning shears down on the low stone wall and took off my other glove. 30 years. I had come to Charleston at 27, a few months after Arthur was offered the position at Whitmore University. At the time, I was running a small landscape design firm out of Savannah, nothing large, but it was mine. 4 employees, a handful of steady clients, a reputation I had spent 4 years building from nothing. When Arthur said he needed me to come with him, I didn't argue. That was who I was then. I closed the business, packed up the studio apartment I loved on Jones Street, and followed him north along the coast. I told myself I'd start again in Charleston. And I did in a way as the woman who designed and maintained the most admired private garden on King Street, as the faculty wife who always knew what to serve at dinner and never embarrassed anyone, as the person who kept the house running so seamlessly that Arthur had apparently forgotten there was a house to run it all. The old estate, that's what I sometimes called it, privately a habit from years of reading about Southern architecture, sat on a corner lot in the heart of the historic district. 3 stories late Federal style, built in 1847. I had purchased it with money left to me by my parents, both gone by the time I was 42. The down payment, the renovation costs, the landscaping, all of it came from that inheritance and from my own savings. Arthur had contributed toward the kitchen appliances and the master bath fixtures. When his department chair came to dinner that first year, Arthur had given him the tour himself, his hand resting proprietarily on the original heart pine banister, saying, "We found this place in rough shape and really made something of it." He earned $180,000 a year. He gave me $800 a month for household expenses and told me the rest was tied up in investments and family obligations. I had never pushed for details. I suppose I thought that was what trust looked like. That evening, I was washing my hands at the kitchen sink when my phone buzzed on the counter, a bank notification. I dried my hands slowly before picking it up. It was the joint checking account, the one we maintained for household expenses. A withdrawal of $48,000 had cleared that afternoon. I stood very still. I opened the banking app. The transaction history loaded slowly the way it always did on the older phone I kept meaning to replace. And then there it was, 6 months of withdrawals laid out in a clean, indifferent column. 8,000 here, 12,000 there, 23,000 in a single transfer in July, 15,000 in August. More than $180,000 gone in increments, small enough that no single one would trip an alert. I'd been so busy tending to everything that had been asked of me that I had not once looked at this account beyond what I needed to pay the household bills. I set my phone down on the porch railing and looked out at the garden, the roses still just barely visible in the last of the evening light, the jasmine beginning to release its night fragrance from the south wall. Everything was exactly where I had put it. Everything was exactly as I had made it. And for the first time in a very long time, I let myself ask the question I had been too careful, too loyal, too afraid to ask. What exactly had Arthur been doing with our money, and who had he been doing it with? That night I didn't sleep. I sat down at the desk in the study, the room Arthur always kept locked when he was home, and I did something I had never done in 30 years of marriage. I looked at everything. The house was quiet in the way old houses get quiet after midnight, when the floorboards settle and the ceiling fans slow to a whisper. My tea had gone cold beside me. I hadn't touched it in over an hour. The desk lamp threw a circle of amber light across the surface of Arthur's oak desk, and I sat inside that circle, the way a person sits inside the last warm room before winter sets in. I didn't come here in a panic. I want to be clear about that. I came here because I had made a decision, a quiet, deliberate decision, the kind that doesn't announce itself with tears or raised voices, but simply arrives one evening and waits for you to notice it. I had spent 30 years not asking questions. Tonight I was going to ask them all. I started with the joint checking account. The withdrawals began in March, $8,000, then 11, then 9,500, then 14, then 8 again. Each one logged under the same description, miscellaneous expenses. No vendor name, no category, no explanation. Just a number carefully chosen, never quite crossing 25,000 in a single transaction. Never triggering the kind of alert that would require a second signature or a phone call from the bank. I know enough about financial structures to recognize a pattern when I see one. Arthur had always handled our accounts, and I had always let him. But I had spent 20 years as a landscape architect, managing project budgets, contractor invoices, and municipal grant paperwork. I understood numbers. I understood in particular the discipline it takes to move large sums of money in small, unremarkable pieces. By the time I had worked through to August, I had underlined 17 separate transactions, $183,000. Gone. I set the statements aside and pulled out the credit card file. Arthur's university provided him with a research travel budget, a real one, modest and well documented, which he reported to the department each semester. What I was looking at was something else entirely. Rome, June 2024. 2 business class tickets, Etihad Airways JFK to FCO, $8,400. 2 tickets. I read it again. Arthur had told me the university was sending him to a conference in Rome. He had mentioned it over dinner one evening in May between bites of the roasted chicken I had made in the casual tone of a man announcing something unremarkable. I'll be gone about 2 weeks. Research grant covers everything. I had nodded and refilled his glass of water and not thought about it again. Hotel Le Meurice, Paris. 4 nights junior suite. $4,620. The Le Meurice is on the Rue de Rivoli, facing the Tuileries Garden. I know this because I looked it up once years ago when Arthur mentioned it as the kind of hotel academics stayed in when their institutions had generous budgets. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. Villa Ilios Santorini. 6 nights. $8,950. I laid all 3 printouts side by side on the desk surface. 3 destinations, 2 tickets each time. 1 research grant that had apparently never resulted in a single reimbursement back to our account. I found the tablet in the bottom drawer face down beneath a folded copy of an old faculty Senate agenda. The battery indicator read 12% when the screen came on. The email application was still open. He hadn't closed it before he left for Rome, or perhaps he hadn't thought to. Perhaps he simply hadn't imagined anyone would ever look. The message at the top of the inbox had no subject line, only a photograph. A young woman in a red dress seated at a candlelit table in what looked like an outdoor restaurant. Behind her, the ochre walls of Rome at night, warm and glowing. She was laughing at something outside the frame, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, one hand raised as if mid-sentence. She was without question beautiful in the particular way of someone who has never had to think about whether she is. Beneath the photograph, a single line of text. "Thank you for last night, Professor. Rome has never tasted quite this good." I looked at her for a long moment. I did not recognize her face, but I recognized the feeling that moved through me when I saw it, the cold. Specific feeling of a truth you have been carrying for a long time, finally stepping into the light where you can see it clearly. I had known something was wrong. I had known it for months, maybe longer. I had simply chosen each time to set the knowing aside and go back to my garden. I set the tablet face down on the desk and picked up my phone. Sarah Collins had been my closest friend for 22 years. Before she retired, she had served 16 years as a circuit court judge in Charleston County. When I called her at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, she answered on the second ring. I told her everything in the order I had found it, the withdrawals, the credit card statements, the tablet, the photograph. I spoke in a level voice. I did not cry. I heard her breathing change as I went through each detail, not the breathing of someone alarmed by what they were hearing, but the breathing of someone who was carefully, methodically thinking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Martha," she said finally, "put the tablet back exactly where you found it, face down. Don't photograph the screen, don't forward the email, don't move anything. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good. Don't do anything else tonight. I'll come to you in the morning." I placed the tablet back in the bottom drawer, face down, precisely where I had found it. Then I closed the drawer. Then I sat down in Arthur's leather chair, the one he had never once offered to let me use, and I stayed there until the first gray light of morning came through the curtains. By the time the sun had cleared the rooftops of King Street, I had made my decision. I was done being the woman who never asked questions. I have known Sarah Collins for 22 years, and I can tell you exactly how we met. It was a neighborhood association meeting in the fall of 2002, the kind of meeting where everyone brings a casserole dish and leaves with a headache. Sarah had just been appointed to the circuit court. She showed up in garden clogs and a linen blazer, looking like a woman who had come straight from pulling weeds and had not considered changing her shoes to be a priority. I was the landscape architect in the third row who kept interrupting the HOA president to explain with increasing impatience that the beautification plan he was proposing would kill every mature live oak on the block. When the meeting ended, Sarah appeared at my elbow with 2 cups of terrible coffee and said, "You were completely right, and he knew it. That's why he kept talking louder." We hadn't left each other's sides since. The morning after I found the tablet, I drove to her house with a manila folder of bank statements and a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I had been awake for 26 hours. I had not cried once. Sarah's library was the kind of room that made you feel the weight of things being taken seriously. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, legal texts organized by jurisdiction, and a faded Persian rug that had survived 3 decades of case files being spread across it. The window looked out onto her back garden where the September light was still soft and slanted. She had made fresh coffee, set out 2 mugs, and was already reading through the statements by the time I sat down across from her. She read in silence for several minutes. I watched her face. "All right," she said, finally setting the pages down with the deliberate care of someone who has spent a career handling documents. "Let's talk about what you're actually dealing with." South Carolina, she explained, is what is called an at-fault divorce state. Unlike states where either party can simply cite irreconcilable differences and walk away with a clean split, South Carolina allows and in fact requires a finding of fault when adultery is claimed. And adultery under South Carolina law is not merely a moral failing, it is a legal one. A spouse found guilty of adultery can be barred entirely from receiving alimony. In a long-term marriage like mine, where I had stepped back from my career to support Arthur's, that distinction carried significant financial weight. But adultery alone isn't the whole picture. Sarah continued. She tapped the underlined column of withdrawals. This $183,000 moved in deliberate increments over 6 months. This is what we call dissipation of marital assets. He didn't lose this money. He spent it on another person. South Carolina courts treat that differently than simple debt. A judge can order that amount factored back into the equitable distribution before anything is divided. I had known Sarah long enough to understand that when she spoke in this tone, measured sequential without editorializing, she was building towards something. I waited. "Before I go any further," she said, "I need to know who the woman in that photograph is." I had spent the night with that question. I hadn't recognized her face in the moment the lighting was soft, the angle partial, and I had never been in a room with her. But I knew the name. I had heard it enough times over the past 3 years that it had lodged itself somewhere in the back of my memory, the way things do when they carry more weight than they're supposed to. Chloe Warren, Arthur's student. She had graduated 3 years ago, one of his doctoral advisees, a woman he had spoken of with a particular quality of admiration that, looking back, should have registered as something other than professional pride. The most gifted student I've taught in 20 years. Remarkable analytical mind. She'll go further than any of us. He had mentioned her at dinner, at faculty events, in passing conversation, always with that same quality in his voice, a warmth he rarely extended to anyone he wasn't trying to impress. I told Sarah the name. I watched her write it down. "I'll have someone confirm it," she said. She'd already made arrangements a private investigator her firm had worked with for years, currently available to take an assignment in Europe. Within 48 hours, she told me we would have documented confirmation of who Arthur was, with in Rome, where they were staying and for how long. Evidence gathered in public spaces, she was careful to note, obtained entirely within legal bounds. I nodded. My coffee had gone cold again. I didn't notice. Then Sarah set her pen down and looked at me directly. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." I waited. "Whose name is on the deed to the King Street house?" The question landed in a way I hadn't expected. I began to answer mine. Originally, it was always mine, and then I stopped, because the full answer was more complicated than that, and somewhere in the part of my brain that had been running quietly in the background since 3 o'clock in the morning. I had already known this question was coming. The house on King Street had been mine before the marriage. My parents had left me a substantial inheritance, the kind that came with accountants and documentation, and I had purchased the property in my name alone, registered as separate property before Arthur and I ever filed a joint tax return. For the first 20 years, I had never thought about it. Then approximately 10 years ago, Arthur had come home late on a rainy October evening. He had been at the department's fall faculty dinner, and he had arrived in that particular loosened state he got after 2 glasses of bourbon. Not drunk precisely, but soft around the edges, inclined to find things simpler than they were. He had set a small stack of papers on the kitchen counter. "Sign these when you get a chance, sweetheart. Just the annual insurance renewal forms. You know how they pile up." I had signed them. I had signed them the way I signed most things Arthur brought home, with the trust of a woman who had spent 30 years believing her husband was at his core, a man who meant well. I had not read them carefully. I had not read them at all. Sarah was watching me. "Do you still have copies of what you signed?" The room was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its morning repertoire in the garden. I thought of my bedroom closet, the far back corner behind the winter coats, where I kept a flat tin box the color of a winter sky. I had owned that box since before I owned the house. Arthur had never once asked about it. I was not certain he knew it existed. Everything I had kept for myself quietly over 30 years, the documents that were mine before he was in that box. "I think I might," I said. I drove home with one thought turning over and over in my mind. In 30 years of marriage, there had always been one corner of this house that belonged only to me, a flat tin box at the back of a closet that Arthur had never opened, never asked about, never known to look for. I needed to know what was inside it. I needed to know exactly what I had signed. My mother gave me the tin box the summer I turned 25 one year, before I started my own firm 6 months after her diagnosis, in the particular manner of a woman who was quietly putting her affairs in order without telling anyone that was what she was doing. "Keep everything that matters in here," she said. "Paper and ink are memory. Don't trust anyone else to hold it for you." I had carried that box through 4 addresses, 1 marriage, and 30 years. I had not opened it in a very long time. That afternoon, I sat down on the floor of my study and spread every single thing inside it across the hardwood. The contents arranged themselves into the categories of a life, the original purchase contract for the King Street house, signed in my name alone in the spring of 1991. Before Arthur and I had filed a single joint tax return, my parents' wills, a life insurance policy with a beneficiary designation I had never updated, paperwork from the landscape architecture firm I had dissolved when the children were small, 3 photographs from our wedding, the ones I had kept because I looked happy in them, not because I was trying to preserve a record. I sorted through everything methodically the way I used to sort site survey documents by date, by category, by relevance. It took the better part of an hour. I was near the bottom of the pile when I found the envelope. It was thin. The paper had gone slightly yellow at the edges the way documents do when they've been stored without acid-free sleeves for a decade. The return address label read, Harrington and Associates Notarial Services, Charleston, SC. There was no cover letter inside, only a single folded document, 4 pages with a notary's embossed seal on the final page that had survived the years in clean, unbroken condition. I read it twice before I fully understood what I was looking at. A deed of gift, executed on the 14th of March, 2014. Arthur Whitfield grantor, conveying all rights, title, and interest in the property at King Street, Charleston, South Carolina, to Martha Hargrove grantee. Unconditional, irrevocable. Witnessed by 2 signatures I didn't recognize, and certified by a notary public whose stamp was still perfectly legible. I sat with the document in my hands and thought backward. The house had been mine at the start, purchased with my inheritance in 1991, registered as my separate property under South Carolina. Law Arthur's name nowhere on the original deed. That had been true for the first 13 years of our marriage. But in 2004, Arthur had come to me with a proposal The east wing needed structural work, the kind of work that costs more than savings accounts can absorb gracefully. He had suggested a refinancing arrangement, a new mortgage, in both our names, using the house as collateral, which would fund the renovation and consolidate some existing debt. It had seemed reasonable. It had seemed like the sensible decision a married couple makes together. What I had not fully understood at the time was that by adding his name to a mortgage secured against the property, Arthur had created a legal argument, not an airtight one, but an arguable one, that he had become a contributing party to the asset. In South Carolina, separate property can shift toward marital classification when a spouse makes substantial contributions to its maintenance or improvement. 10 years of joint mortgage payments had given Arthur something he hadn't started with a theoretical claim. And then, in 2014, he had signed it all away. I remembered the evening now with a clarity I hadn't had before. It was October. Late October, the air already cool the oak trees on King Street just beginning to turn. Arthur had attended the university's annual faculty dinner, the kind of event that ran long and involved bourbon in quantities that made him softer around the edges than usual. He had come home after 11, still wearing his good jacket, carrying a small stack of papers against his chest. "Sign these when you get a chance, sweetheart. Just insurance renewal forms. You know how the university is about paperwork." I had signed 2 pages, I remembered that much. I had signed them at the kitchen counter without my reading glasses, trusting the description, trusting the man. What I understood now, sitting on the floor of my study with a decade-old notarized document in my hands, was why he had done it. In the fall of 2014, Gary Whitfield's gambling had reached a crisis point for the first time. A debt of $85,000 to a private creditor who had begun making legal inquiries. Arthur had been fielding calls, managing his brother, quietly keeping the situation away from me. And Arthur, who understood enough about asset protection to know that a creditor pursuing Gary might find grounds for a broader claim against family assets, had taken steps. He had signed the house back to me entirely not out of generosity but out of calculation. He was protecting the property from Gary's creditors by removing himself from the title. He had handed me a legal weapon and not realized it because he had never imagined I would look for it. I photographed every page of the document and sent them to Sarah. She called back in 9 minutes. "Martha." Her voice had that quality it got when she was working to stay measured. "This is a properly executed deed of gift. It is legally binding, and it cannot be revoked. That house is 100% yours. Arthur has no ownership interest whatsoever." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. But the question that remained the one I sat with as I looked out at the garden, the late afternoon light falling long and gold across the boxwoods I had planted myself 20 years ago, was not about what the document said. It was about why. Arthur was a meticulous man. He did not make administrative errors. If he had signed this, he had meant to sign something. He simply had not anticipated that the woman he handed the pen to would one day know what to do with it. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's low, careful the voice of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say and was still not entirely sure they should say it. "Is this Martha Hargrove, Arthur Whitfield's wife?" "Speaking." "My name is Linda. I'm Gary's wife. I think we need to meet. Today, if you can manage it. I have something you need to see." In 20 years of knowing Linda Whitfield, we had never once had a real conversation. She'd always looked at me the way people look at something they both want and resent, with a smile that never reached her eyes, a warmth that started and stopped precisely at the surface. She had married into the Whitfield family the same year I had planted the back garden, and we had moved through the same rooms at the same family dinners for 2 decades, like furniture that had learned to avoid each other. So why was she calling me now, and why did her voice sound like she was frightened? I chose a coffee shop at the far end of Folly Beach, 40 minutes from King Street, the kind of place where nobody from our neighborhood would think to be on a Tuesday afternoon. Linda was already there when I arrived. She had taken the corner table back against the wall the way people sit when they want to see the door without being seen from it. Whatever was in her cup had gone cold. She was dressed the way Linda Whitfield always dressed, carefully, deliberately, nothing obviously out of place. But her eyes told a different story. She looked like a woman who had not slept in 3 days and had made peace with the fact that sleep was no longer the point. I sat down across from her and waited. "I'm not here out of loyalty to family," she said. "No greeting, no preamble. I want you to understand that before I say anything else. I'm here because I've watched Gary steer something toward a wall for 4 years, and I will not be in the vehicle when it hits." She started with the debt. $340,000 accumulated across 7 years. Private lenders, a syndicated poker group out of Savannah. 2 individuals whose methods of collection did not involve attorneys or payment plans. Gary had been managing the pressure the way people like Gary always manage pressure, by finding new sources of money to stay ahead of the old ones. For years, Arthur had been that source. Quietly, consistently, the way older brothers absorb younger brothers' disasters until the weight becomes structural. By 4 years ago, Arthur's patience had reached its limit. That's when Gary found Chloe Warren, Linda said. Chloe had been a doctoral student at Whitmore University. She was also at the time Gary approached her $60,000 in debt to him, personally, a private loan taken during a financial crisis in her 2nd year of graduate school, callable on terms she could not meet. Gary offered her a transaction, the debt forgiven in full. In exchange, she would enroll in Arthur Whitfield's graduate seminar, make herself known to him, and build a relationship. She did not need to manufacture feelings. She only needed to be present, consistent, and attentive in the particular way that men like Arthur, men who have spent decades being the most important person in every room, find irresistible. Did she know what Gary actually intended? I asked. Linda set her cup down carefully. She knew Arthur would eventually be asked to help with Gary's financial situation. She chose not to ask what that meant in practice. I thought about the photograph on Arthur's tablet, the woman in the red dress at the Trevi fountain laughing at something outside the frame. I wondered not for the first time how much of what she had built with Arthur was genuine, and how much was simply the performance of a woman who had run out of other options. Perhaps after 4 years, even she no longer knew where one ended and the other began. What was Gary planning to do with Arthur? I asked. Specifically. Linda's hands tightened around her cup. Gary needed $950,000 to clear his debts and set himself up somewhere no one could find him. The King Street house is worth nearly $3 million. It's in your name, Gary knows that. He's always known that. She paused. When she continued, her voice had dropped half a register. The plan wasn't to ask you to sign anything, Martha. Not directly. Gary found someone, a notary in Charleston, someone with debts of his own and flexible principles. The mortgage application was already being prepared. When Arthur came home from Rome, the paperwork would be submitted to the lender with your signature already on it. The room was very quiet for a moment. A forged signature, I said. Yes, I let that settle. $950,000 in debt secured against my property, executed without my knowledge, with my name written by someone else's hand. Under federal law, that is bank fraud. Under South Carolina law, it is felony forgery. The kind of thing that does not end with civil litigation, it ends with handcuffs. Arthur agreed to this. Arthur agreed to not ask questions, Linda said, which Gary tells him is the same thing. She reached into her bag and placed a USB drive on the table between us. Arthur's private account statements, the account I had not known existed, and the message thread between Arthur and Gary, 6 weeks old, time-stamped the week before Arthur left for Rome. She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me without being asked. The messages loaded. I scrolled until I found the exchange Linda had clearly read many times herself, judging by how precisely she had described it. Arthur's message sent on a Thursday evening at 11:42. This is further than I agreed to go. Gary's response 4 minutes later. You don't get to have a position on this anymore. You lost that when you let me handle the Chloe situation. I have everything. You know I have everything. Come home, smile at your wife, and let me take care of the rest. Arthur's final reply, fine, just make sure it's clean. I read the exchange twice. Not because I didn't understand it, because I wanted to remember it exactly, every word, every timestamp, every absence of pushback from the man I had shared a bed with for 30 years. Just make sure it's clean. He had known. He had known precisely what Gary was planning, and his only concern had been the execution. Linda named her price without apology, $85,000 transferred directly, no paper trail, no testimony, no appearance in any legal document under any circumstances. Enough to leave Charleston and not look back. I told her I would need to speak with my attorney before I could agree to anything. She nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer. I put the USB drive in my coat pocket and stood up. Outside, the October wind was coming off the Atlantic cold flat and entirely indifferent to everything happening on the other side of the glass. I walked to my car and sat there for a long time before I turned the key. Just make sure it's clean. 30 years. And in the end, that was all I had been to him, a logistical problem he preferred not to think about too carefully. All right, Arthur, let's see how clean this gets. The morning after Folly Beach, Sarah drove me downtown. Harrison and Associates occupied the 12th floor of a glass building on Broad Street, the kind of office that tells you before you have said a single word that the person inside has won considerably more cases than he has lost. The receptionist offered coffee without being asked. The carpet was the color of old money. Every surface was clean in the particular way of spaces where serious work gets done, and the people doing it have long since stopped needing to perform seriousness. Edward Harrison met us at the door of his conference room. He was 61, lean, with the unhurried bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades in Charleston courtrooms and had learned that the attorney who appears least concerned is almost always the one holding the stronger hand. He shook my hand, then Sarah's, and gestured toward the chairs on the far side of the table without preamble. "Show me what you have," he said. I laid everything out in the order I had found it. The bank statements with their 17 underlined withdrawals, the credit card records from Le Maurice Santorini, the Etihad business class, tickets booked in pairs. The deed of gift, original notarized, dated the 14th of March 2014, with Arthur's signature at the bottom in the particular cramped cursive he used when he was signing something quickly. The preliminary report from the private investigator Sarah had retained 3 pages of time-stamped observations from Rome, including photographs of Arthur and a woman matching Chloe Warren's description at 2 separate restaurants and 1 hotel entrance. And finally, the USB drive Arthur's private account statements and the message thread between Arthur and Gary, ending with the line I had committed to memory on the drive back from Folly Beach. "Just make sure it's clean." Harrison read everything in sequence without interrupting. He made 3 notes on a yellow legal pad. He did not change expression once. When he finished, he set his pen down and folded his hands on the table. "All right. Let me tell you exactly where you stand. The deed of gift," he said, "was the foundation of everything. Under South Carolina property law specifically, Section 20-7-473 of the state code. A validly executed and notarized deed of gift conveying separate property is legally binding and irrevocable by the grantor. Arthur Whitfield had no ownership interest in the King Street property. He had not had one for 10 years. Any mortgage application submitted against that property without Martha's written consent was legally void from the moment of execution. It did not matter who signed it, who notarized it, or which lender accepted it. If Arthur submits that mortgage application with a forged signature, Harrison said, he is not committing a civil wrong. He is committing a federal crime. Bank fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1344 carries a maximum sentence of 30 years. The notary who certifies a forged document faces criminal prosecution and permanent loss of licensure under South Carolina Code Section 1613-10. This is not a gray area. He turned to the bank statements. The $183,000 withdrawn from the joint account over 6 months, he explained, constituted dissipation of marital assets under South Carolina Code, Section 20-3-620. In an equitable distribution proceeding, a court could order that amount factored back into the marital estate before any division was calculated. Combined with the evidence of adultery documented by the investigator's report and the email on the tablet, Martha had grounds for an at-fault divorce under Section 20-3-10. Under Section 20-3-130, a spouse found guilty of adultery is categorically barred from receiving alimony. He will receive nothing from this marriage, Harrison said, and he will owe a great deal. The $183,000 drawn from your joint account is only part of the picture, the full $480,000 directed to Ms. Warren includes transfers from accounts in his name alone, which we will document separately. Then he outlined the plan. The first step would happen before the end of the day. Harrison's office would file a lis pendens, a formal notice of pending legal action against the King Street property at the Charleston County Recorder of Deeds, under Section 151110 of the South Carolina Code. The moment that filing was recorded, any attempt to transfer mortgage or encumber the property would be flagged immediately. Any lender conducting standard title due diligence, which Palmetto Private Finance would be legally required to do before dispersing funds, would find the notice and halt the transaction. Palmetto Private Finance, I said. Harrison nodded. The investigator found email correspondence between Arthur and their loan officer. The application is in progress. Arthur's return flight from Rome is booked for 2 weeks from today. The signing is likely scheduled for within days of his arrival. The second step within the week, Harrison's office would subpoena Palmetto Private Finance's loan file and secure a full copy of the mortgage application, including any signature pages already prepared through emergency discovery proceedings. The third step, running in parallel the formal divorce filing and a separate criminal referral to the Charleston County Sheriff's Office regarding the conspiracy to commit forgery and bank fraud. The USB evidence, he said, was sufficient to initiate a criminal investigation. Linda Whitfield's $85,000 request, he advised, should not be paid directly. It created unnecessary legal exposure. The USB evidence stood on its own. If Linda chose to come forward voluntarily, that was her decision to make. He turned the legal pad toward me and placed a pen beside it. I'll need your authorization to proceed on all 3 tracks simultaneously. I signed where he indicated. Harrison looked at me across the oak table, and for the first time since we had sat down, something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but the particular quality of a professional who has assessed a situation and found the outcome satisfactory. 2 weeks, he said. That is our window. Once Arthur signs that mortgage application with a forged version of your name, the legal process becomes significantly more complicated, not insurmountable, but months longer and considerably more expensive. We act now, or we spend the better part of next year untangling what he has already done. I looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at me. 2 weeks. In 30 years of marriage, I had moved slowly, carefully, always deferring, always waiting. 2 weeks felt like the first real deadline I had ever set for myself. Let's begin, I said. People tend to imagine the important moments of their lives unfolding in dramatic settings, high-ceilinged courtrooms, offices paneled in dark walnut, confrontations in the rain outside buildings with columns. The most consequential hour of my legal battle took place in a ground-floor government office on Meeting Street under fluorescent lighting. With a numbered ticket in my hand and a clerk who had not yet had enough coffee, Harrison arrived before me. He was standing near the entrance when I pulled into the parking lot at 8:45, holding 2 cups from the coffee cart on the corner and looking like a man for whom government offices held no particular intimidation. He handed me one of the cups without comment. We went inside. The Charleston County Register of Deeds processes property filings the way all government offices process things, in careful sequence without urgency, according to procedures that were designed to be thorough rather than fast. We waited 20 minutes before our number was called. Harrison set his briefcase on the counter and opened it with the efficiency of a man who has done this many times. The first filing was the notice of lost original documents, a formal declaration that the original purchase contract and certain associated paperwork from the 1991 acquisition were no longer in the owner's possession. Under South Carolina procedure, once that notice was logged and published, any party attempting to use documents purporting to be originals in a transaction would be immediately flagged. It was Harrison had explained to me the day before a precautionary measure not legally essential given the deed of gift, but useful as an additional layer. The clerk stamped it, dated it, and moved to the second filing. The lis pendens took slightly longer to process. It is a formal notice of pending legal action, a declaration entered into the public property record, that the ownership or disposition of a specific parcel of real estate is currently subject to litigation. Harrison had prepared the document with the precision I had come to expect from him, the legal description of the King Street property. The case number from the divorce filing his office had initiated the previous afternoon, and a clear statement that any transfer encumbrance or mortgage executed against the property without the written consent of Martha Hargrove, sole title holder of record, would be subject to immediate legal challenge. The clerk reviewed it, cross-referenced the deed record, and entered it into the system. "Effective immediately," she said, and stamped the file copy. Harrison slid the stamped copy across the counter to me without ceremony. I held it for a moment. It was a single page, unremarkable in every visual respect, the kind of document you could mistake for a utility form if you weren't reading it carefully. What it meant in practical terms was that any title company, any lender, any attorney conducting due diligence on the King Street property from this moment forward would find this notice within the first 60 seconds of their search. The house was, as of 8 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning in October, untouchable. We were back on Broad Street by 10:30. Harrison sent the letter to Palmetto Private Finance from his office, while I sat in the chair across from his desk and finished my coffee. It was a single-page, formal, precise, and entirely without hostility in tone, which somehow made it more authoritative than aggression would have. It notified the company that the property at King Street, Charleston, was the subject of active divorce litigation, that a lis pendens had been filed and recorded that morning, that the sole legal title holder had not authorized and would not authorize any mortgage or encumbrance against the property, and that any loan disbursed under these circumstances would be contested in court with all available legal remedies. Harrison's assistant called at 11:47 with confirmation Palmetto Private Finance had suspended the application pending review of the title status. Their legal department, she said, had located the lis pendens within 20 minutes of receiving Harrison's letter. The loan Arthur had spent 4 years building toward was on hold before he had even landed in Charleston. From the bank, it took less time than I expected. I called from the parking lot outside Harrison's building, identified myself as a joint account holder, and reported a pattern of unauthorized transactions I wished to have reviewed by the fraud department. The representative asked me to hold, transferred me twice, and then informed me that a temporary administrative freeze had been placed on the account pending investigation. The balance at the time of the freeze, $35,000. I noted the confirmation number and put my phone in my bag. Arthur called at 4:17 in the afternoon. I was sitting in my car in the driveway of the King Street house, still in my coat, watching the light change on the garden. His name appeared on my screen, and I sat for exactly 3 seconds before I answered. "Martha." His voice was unhurried, warm even in the particular register he used when he was feeling generous. "Just checking in. Everything all right at the house?" "Fine," I said. "The garden's still standing. How's the research going?" "Productive, long days, but good conversations." A pause. "You remembered to water the greenhouse plants. Tuesday and Friday, same as always." "Good." Another pause, the comfortable kind, the kind of silence between two people who have run out of new things to say to each other and have stopped noticing. "I'll be back in about 10 days. Don't wait up on the exact date, the schedule keeps shifting." "Take your time," I said. "I hear the octopus in Santorini is worth the extra few days." He laughed the short, self-satisfied laugh of a man who believes he is not being watched. "It really is," he said. "Good night, Martha." "Good night, Arthur." The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The investigators' photographs arrived at 9 that evening. Arthur and a young woman at a villa with an infinity pool facing the Aegean, the water behind them, the particular shade of blue that only exists in photographs from that part of the world. The woman was in a white dress. Around her neck, catching the last of the evening light, was a diamond pendant necklace I recognized without difficulty. I had pointed it out in a jewelry catalog 2 years ago, the autumn before our 25th anniversary. Arthur had glanced at it and said, "That's excessive. You don't need something like that." I looked at the photograph for a moment. Then I deleted it. The investigator had the originals properly stored, properly documented. I put my phone in my coat pocket and walked back to Harrison's building to collect my copies of the day's filings. The legal framework was complete. The loan was frozen. The account was locked. Everything Arthur believed he was coming home to had quietly ceased to exist. What remained now was a different kind of question entirely. In 10 days, a man I had been married to for 30 years was going to walk through the front door of a house he no longer owned, expecting to find the woman he had always assumed he understood. I needed to decide who I was going to be when he got there. There is a particular skill you develop after 30 years of landscape architecture. You learn to see space the way a camera lens sees it, where the light lands, where shadow collects. Which angle tells the truest version of a story? That week, I walked through every room of the King Street house with a different kind of attention. Not as the woman who lived there, as someone documenting what was about to end. True Guard Security sent 2 technicians on a Wednesday morning. I had called them the day before, described what I needed, and been told they could have everything installed within 4 hours. They were professional, quiet, and asked no questions beyond the technical ones. 4 cameras total the front parlor, the dining room, the main hallway, and Arthur's study. Each one small enough to be easily overlooked, one behind the mantel clock, one above the hallway credenza, one recessed into the bookshelf trim in the study. Framed by the spines of books Arthur had never read. The footage streamed to a private cloud server registered in my name. Arthur had no access credentials. He did not know the account existed. When the technicians left, I stood in the center of the parlor and looked at the room the way I had looked at garden installations before a client walked through, checking sightlines, checking coverage, checking for gaps. There were none. The house that Arthur had lived in for 30 years was now in every meaningful sense mine. Sarah called that afternoon. "Whitmore University sent out the official announcement this morning," she said. "Faculty newsletter, alumni email lists the works. Professor of the Year ceremony, November 15th, main auditorium. 400 guests expected. Local press board of trustees, the full production." I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the October light was coming through the window at the low angle it gets in the south, when autumn finally decides to arrive golden and unhurried, as if the season has all the time in the world. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking about timing," I said. "You were going to meet with the provost 1 week before the ceremony. I'll go in my capacity as a retired circuit court judge, present the full evidence package, the investigator's report, the financial documentation, the USB materials. It goes through the faculty ethics board. That's the proper channel, and it carries weight because of how it arrives." I was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, I could see the street, the wide sidewalk, the live oaks lining the pavement, the public space that ran along the front of every property on King Street. "Sarah," I said, "is there any legal reason I couldn't rent a freestanding LED display screen and have it placed on the public sidewalk outside the university gates?" There was a brief pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register she used when she was working through a legal question in real time. "Public sidewalk, not university property." "Correct. And the content would be footage you legally own recorded on your own property by a system you installed." "Yes." Another pause. "First Amendment protects expression on public property. The City of Charleston would require a standard commercial permit for a temporary structure on the sidewalk that's a routine application. Nothing unusual about it. You're not accessing the university's systems, you're not on their property, and you own the content. As long as everything you display is factually accurate and you hold the rights to the recordings." She stopped. "Martha, that's completely legal." "I know," I said. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since Tuesday." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the exhale of someone who has just recalibrated their estimate of a situation. "I'll have Harrison check the permit process. We can have it filed by end of week." Daniel called after dinner. He was my eldest, 31 years old, working as a structural engineer in Atlanta with his father's height, and I had always privately thought considerably more of his father's intelligence than Arthur had ever bothered to notice. He called on a Tuesday evening routine that had started during the pandemic and never quite ended, and I answered the way I always did. We talked about his work, a bridge assessment project running over schedule, his apartment, a restaurant he had tried the previous weekend. I asked the right questions in the right places and kept my voice at the register I had been practicing for weeks, level present, unhurried. "Mom," he said toward the end of the call, you sound different." Different? How? He thought about it for a moment in the particular way Daniel had always thought about things, carefully taking the question seriously. "More like yourself," he said finally. I don't know how else to say it. Just more like yourself. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the parlor for a long time, looking up at the small camera lens set into the bookshelf, trim above the fireplace. I thought about what Daniel had said. I thought about what it meant that my son, who had grown up watching me be a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of marriage, could hear the difference in my voice after 3 weeks of simply acting in my own interest. 30 years. And apparently all it had taken to sound like myself was to finally start behaving like it. I sat down at the desk in the parlor and opened my laptop. I'd been turning over a problem that had nothing to do with legal strategy or financial evidence. It had to do with a person, one specific person, and a truth she had never been told. I typed a name Dorothy, not just any Dorothy, a very particular one. A woman whose voice I had heard exactly once 29 years ago on a phone call I had ended before she could finish her first sentence. She'd been Arthur's wife before I was. She had called me 1 year into our marriage. I never knew how she got the number, and I had heard her voice just long enough to understand what kind of call it was before I put the phone down. "There's something you should 29 years. I'd spent 29 years not knowing how that sentence ended. Sarah had found Dorothy's number earlier in the week without asking me why I wanted it. That was the thing about Sarah, she understood the shape of a situation before you had finished describing it. I looked at the number for a long time. There are calls you make because you need information. There are calls you make because you owe someone a truth they were never given. This was the second kind. I picked up the phone. The night I called Dorothy, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea first. It was something my mother used to do, brew a pot of chamomile whenever she was preparing to do something that required more courage than she wanted to admit it did. She never called it that. She would say she was simply thirsty, or that the evening had turned cool, or that chamomile helped her think. But I had watched her make that same tea before every difficult conversation of her adult life. And I understood the ritual for what it was, a way of telling your hands to stop shaking before you picked up the phone. I sat in the armchair by the south window, the one that looked out over the garden, and I thought about what I knew about Dorothy before I dialed. It amounted to very little. Her full name, Dorothy Whitfield née Caldwell, age 62. Arthur's first wife, married in 1987, divorced in 1993, the year before Arthur and I met at a faculty garden party where he had quoted Wendell Berry to me, and I had thought, foolishly and completely, that I had found the right man. Arthur's account of the marriage had been brief and consistent over the years. She was controlling. They had wanted different things. It had simply run its course. He delivered this explanation with the mild regret of a man describing a car he had traded in, not unkind, not particularly interested in revisiting it. I had believed him. Of course I had believed him. That was the year I was 27 and still under the impression that a man who quoted poetry to you under garden lights was at his core someone worth trusting. 1 year into our marriage, sometime in the early spring of 1995, Dorothy had called me. I remembered the phone ringing in the kitchen of the smaller house we were renting then, before King Street, before the children. I had answered, and a woman's voice I didn't recognize had said, "I just want you to know he doesn't change. Please be careful." I had hung up without responding. I had told myself in the days that followed that it was the call of a bitter woman who hadn't finished grieving a marriage she'd lost. I had filed it away in the category of things I had decided not to think about. I had kept that file closed for 29 years. Dorothy answered on the third ring. Her voice was calm, not the careful calm of someone bracing themselves, but the settled calm of a person who had long since made peace with being surprised by things. I introduced myself. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "I've wondered," she said, "whether you'd ever call." We talked for a long time. It surprised me afterward how little of the conversation was about Arthur. We talked about Savannah, where Dorothy had lived for the past 18 years, a small apartment near Forsyth Park, a kitchen garden she had built in containers on the balcony, tomatoes and herbs, and one obstinate fig tree she had kept alive through 3 consecutive drought summers, through what she described as sheer personal stubbornness. She had worked as a librarian for 12 years after the divorce. She had not remarried. She said this without particular weight, the way you state a fact about your life that you have finished being sad about. I told her about the landscape architecture, about the children, about the house on King Street. I did not yet tell her why I was calling. After a while, I said, "I owe you an apology for 1995. "Or no," she said. "You don't. I would have done exactly the same thing." A pause. "I knew when I made that call that you wouldn't hear it. You weren't ready to hear it. Nobody is at that stage. I should have listened." "Maybe," she said, "but you had to find out the way you found out. That's how it goes with men like Arthur. They're very good at making the truth feel like an insult." We sat with that for a moment. Outside my window, the garden was dark, the jasmine invisible in the shadows, but present you could tell by the faint sweetness in the air that came through the crack in the window frame. "Dorothy," I said, "I'm going to sell the house on King Street." "All right, I want to sell it to you." The silence that followed was longer this time. I let it stand. "Why?" she asked finally. I had thought about how to answer this question. I had drafted several versions, some more strategic than others. In the end, I said the true thing. "Because you deserve to see how this ends, and because I don't want to hand it to a stranger. I want it to go to someone who understands what this house actually cost, not in dollars." Dorothy was quiet for long enough that I began to wonder if the line had dropped. Then, how much? $2,650,000. Cash sale through my attorney completed within 2 weeks. The title is clean. I have documentation going back to the original 1991 purchase. There are no liens, no encumbrances pending the resolution of a lis pendens that will be cleared upon divorce finalization. That's below market. Yes. Why? Because I'm not selling a house, I said. I'm ending something. The price reflects that. Another silence. Then very quietly, "All right, Martha, I'll do it." She had one condition. She stated it without preamble in the same tone she had used for everything else. "I want to be there when he comes home. I never got a proper goodbye. I'd like to be the one who opens the door this time." I did not hesitate. Done. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. I had not expected it, and I found that I could not stop turning it over afterward. "Do you know what's strange, Martha? The house he never gave me is on the other side of this city somewhere. And the house he gave you and then tried to take back, that's the one I'm going to fill with the thing he never could provide either of us." "What's that?" I asked, though I thought I already knew. "Quiet," she said. "Just ordinary quiet." I sat holding the phone in my lap for a long time after she ended the call. Outside the garden was dark. The jasmine was there, even though I couldn't see it, the way some things are truest when they're invisible. 30 years. 2 women. One man who had looked at both of us and calculated that we were the kind of people who would never compare notes. The last piece had found its place. I signed the sale contract on a Tuesday morning at Harrison's office, blue ink on cream paper, and I read every word before I picked up the pen. It took 40 minutes. Harrison waited without comment. Some things deserve to be done slowly. The notary witnessed my signature, stamped the document, and slid a copy across the table. Harrison shook my hand in the way of a man who understood that what had just happened was larger than its paperwork. $2,650,000 would transfer into the irrevocable trust within 5 business days. Arthur's name appeared nowhere in the transaction. It had not appeared on the title for over a decade. The house was mine to sell, and I had sold it, and the whole of it was entirely legally, finally done. I drove back to King Street alone. I had told myself I would be efficient about it. A few hours, the things that mattered, and then out. What I had not accounted for was the way a house holds 30 years of a life, not in the large things which are easy to identify and easy to leave, but in the textures. The particular creak of the third stair from the top. The way afternoon light came through the east window of the upstairs hallway at 4 o'clock and turned the floorboards the color of warm honey. The smell of the old plaster in the back bedroom that no paint had ever quite covered. I started in Arthur's study, the books I left. They were his notes in the margins, his system of organization, his accumulated performance of intellectual life. What I took were my things, which had somehow ended up in his room over the years, the way a person's belongings migrate in a long marriage. The landscape architecture reference volumes I had bought in graduate school, 3 sketchbooks of hand-drawn site plans from projects in the 90s, and the portfolio binder from the firm I had operated in Savannah for 6 years before Daniel was born. I had not opened that binder in more than 2 decades. Standing in Arthur's study, I opened it to the first page. My handwriting, my drafting. A residential garden project for a couple in Savannah's historic district completed in 1992. I remembered the clients, a retired school teacher and her husband, who had wanted something that would attract monarchs in the fall migration. I had planted goldenrod and native asters along the south fence. I wondered if the plants were still there. I closed the binder and carried it to the front hallway. In the bedroom, I went directly to the far corner of the closet, the shelf behind the winter coats where the tin box had lived, since before any of this had been Arthur's house. I did not open the box. I had already taken what I needed from it. What I was looking for was the small red velvet case on the shelf beside it, my mother's pearl earrings, a matched pair, cream-colored set in simple gold. She had worn them every Sunday of my childhood and left them to me, specifically not as part of the estate, but in a separate note that said only, "These are for the occasions when you need to remember who you come from." I had worn them twice in 30 years at her funeral and at my father's. I had kept them in the velvet case because I had been afraid of losing them, which was, I realize now, a particular kind of foolishness, treating something precious as too precious to use. I put them on standing at the bedroom mirror. They suited me. They had always suited me. I had simply forgotten to wear them. The painting in the front parlor had hung in the same spot since 1999. I had painted it the year before a low country marsh scene, the particular gray-green of the South Carolina coastal plain, in early morning light, coming flat across the water. I had painted it during Daniel's afternoon nap over the course of several weeks. No one in this house had ever asked me when I painted it or why. I lifted it from the wall and carried it to my car. In the kitchen, I took my mother's knife set, which I had brought into the marriage and somehow never reclaimed as specifically mine, and a blue ceramic pitcher I had bought at a craft fair in my first year in Charleston before I knew anyone here, when I had been 26 and new to the city and still the kind of person who bought beautiful things for the pleasure of owning them. Then I went out to the garden. I had not intended to take anything from the garden. You cannot take a garden, it belongs to the ground, and the ground belongs to whoever owns it next. What I had planted over 30 years would continue without me. The camellias along the north wall, the wisteria on the iron fence, the 4 different varieties of hosta in the shade garden under the water oak. Dorothy would inherit them. I found I did not mind that. But I cut 1 rose from the climber on the east trellis, a pale yellow variety I had grafted myself in 2001 from a cutting given to me by a woman at the Plant Society. I wrapped the stem in a damp paper towel and put it in the car. Then I went back inside and called my children. Daniel arrived 40 minutes after I called. Claire, who lived in Mount Pleasant, was there in 20. They were different from each other in the way siblings often are. Daniel measured and careful, Claire arriving with her coat half-buttoned and her face already reading the room for what was wrong. I told them everything. I used the same order I had used with Harrison, which was the order of discovery. The bank statements, the credit card records, the tablet, the USB, the forgery plan, the deed of gift, the sale. I did not soften any of it. I did not protect Arthur's image, which was something I realized as I spoke I had been doing for 30 years without noticing. They listened without interrupting. Daniel stood up when I finished and crossed the room and held on to me in the way he had not since he was a teenager. He said, "Mom, you should have told us sooner. We could have helped." "I know," I said. "I wasn't ready to ask for help yet. I am now." Claire was quiet for a moment longer. Then, "What about Dad?" "Your father made his choices," I said. "What happens next between him and the law is not something I control. What happens between the two of you and him, that's yours to decide. I'm not asking you to feel any particular way about him. I'm only asking you to see clearly what happened." Claire nodded slowly. Daniel kept his hand on my shoulder. I locked the front door at 5:15 and slid the key into an envelope addressed to Harrison's office. I dropped it in the brass mail slot set into the door of a law firm 2 buildings down. I did not look back when I walked to my car. When the taxi turned off King Street, my phone buzzed. "Claire, Mom, the yellow roses on the east fence are still blooming. I took a picture for you." The photograph showed the roses in the last of the afternoon light, pale gold against the old brick, unhurried, unaware that anything had changed. I typed back one word, "Good." 5 days. Arthur would land at Charleston International in 5 days, expecting to walk through the door of a house that no longer existed, not for him. That evening, I moved into a furnished apartment on Rutledge Avenue. It smelled of fresh paint and something I did not immediately have a name for. Possibility, I decided. That was the word. I slept better that night than I had in years. 5 days can stretch like a year or compress to an hour depending entirely on what you do with them. I spent mine preparing not with the anxious, second-guessing quality of preparation I had known in my earlier life, but with the focused calm of someone who has already made every decision that needed to be made and is simply executing them in sequence. The apartment on Rutledge smelled of paint and newness. I had bought a French press, a good knife, and a set of plain white dishes. It was the first kitchen that had been entirely mine in 30 years, and I found I liked it considerably more than I had expected to. Sarah had met with Provost Davis the week before on the 8th, a Thursday, 1 week ahead of the ceremony as planned. She had gone in her capacity as a retired circuit court judge, which meant that when his assistant called to confirm the appointment, the provost had not delegated it to a deputy. He had cleared his own calendar. By the time I moved into the Rutledge apartment, Sarah had already received his response. The Faculty Ethics Committee had convened an emergency session. A formal investigation into Professor Arthur Whitfield had been opened under Section 4. 7 of the Whitmore Faculty Handbook, the provision governing relationships between faculty members and former students within 5 years of graduation. Chloe Warren had received her doctorate 3 years ago. The timeline placed the relationship squarely within the prohibited period. The provost had made one decision that surprised neither Sarah nor me. He had not canceled the ceremony. The investigation was ongoing, he noted, and no formal finding had yet been issued. The November 15th event would proceed as scheduled. That was fine. We had planned for exactly that. The permit for the LED display had cleared on the 9th. Harrison's office had filed it the week prior routine commercial permit for a temporary structure on a public sidewalk, approved without complications by the city of Charleston. Charleston Event Displays delivered the unit on the morning of the 10th, 15 feet wide, 8 feet tall, mounted on a freestanding wheeled frame. Positioned at the corner of College and Glebe Streets directly outside the main gate of Whitmore University. It sat dark and inert on the pavement wrapped in weather protection, a large and unremarkable piece of equipment that passers-by glanced at without particular interest. It would go live at 6 o'clock in the evening on November 15th. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 7. The content had been prepared by a media production company Sarah used for legal presentations, a Charleston firm accustomed to handling sensitive evidentiary material. 3 categories of content photographs taken by the private investigator in Rome, Paris, and Santorini, all captured in public spaces. The message thread between Gary and Arthur, drawn from the USB drive Linda had left on the table at Folly Beach, payment refused, evidence kept, and a side-by-side salary comparison prepared from public university records set against the household allowance figure Arthur himself had documented. A defamation attorney Sarah retained for a single consultation had reviewed the content and signed off everything displayed was factually documented, legally obtained, and accurately represented. Truth is an absolute defense. The screen would not accuse, it would simply show. Arthur called on the 12th. Paris time mid-afternoon, which put him at Charles de Gaulle, likely in the business lounge, the kind of unhurried call a man makes when he is feeling satisfied with himself. "Just checking in," he said. "I'll be back the 14th, late afternoon flight." "Safe travels," I said. "Are you planning to go straight to the ceremony from the airport, or will you come home first?" "Home first. Change collect myself. The university is sending a car." A pause. "Will you be there at the ceremony?" I let a beat of warmth into my voice, the particular warmth of a woman who's been waiting patiently for her husband to return. "Of course, Arthur. I wouldn't miss it." "Good." He sounded genuinely pleased. "The navy suit, I think, the one with the chalk stripe." "I'll make sure it's pressed," I said. He said goodbye with the easy finality of a man who considers a conversation successfully completed. 4 minutes. 11 seconds, nearly the same length as the call from Santorini 3 weeks earlier. He had not noticed the similarity. He was not the kind of man who tracked that sort of thing about conversations with his wife. 2 hours after he hung up, my phone showed a message from Sarah. She had forwarded an image, a screenshot taken by the investigator who had been watching Gary in Charleston. Gary had been sitting in a coffee shop on East Bay Street, phone visible on the table, and the investigator had captured the screen from a legal angle. The message on Gary's phone was from Arthur, time-stamped 40 minutes after our call had ended. "Martha's fine. No suspicion whatsoever. She's coming to the ceremony tomorrow. Everything is going exactly as planned." I read it twice. Then I set the phone on the kitchen counter of my new apartment in my kitchen, with my French press and my plain white dishes, and I stood there for a moment, thinking about the particular quality of a man's blindness when he has spent 30 years constructing it carefully and calling it confidence. Arthur was not stupid. He had managed a 4-year plan involving 3 other people, financial institutions, legal documents, and an international itinerary, without once arousing my suspicion until the night I decided to look. That required a certain kind of intelligence. What it did not require, apparently, was the imagination to consider that the woman he had dismissed might one day stop agreeing to be dismissible. I thought about the LED screen sitting dark on the corner of College and Glebe. I thought about Dorothy, who was driving up from Savannah tomorrow and would be waiting at the King Street house when Arthur's taxi arrived. I thought about Provost Davis and the Faculty Ethics Committee and the investigators' photographs and 31 years of Edward Harrison's legal career, all of it now in motion. All of it pointed in the same direction. "Everything is going exactly as planned," Arthur had written. Yes, I thought. It really is. I set an alarm for 6 in the morning and went to bed. Tomorrow, Arthur Whitfield would land at Charleston International Airport, take a taxi to King Street, and walk toward a door he believed was his. He would be carrying 30 years of assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. Every single one of them was wrong. I slept without difficulty for the 2nd night in a row. Before I tell you what Arthur saw when that taxi turned onto King Street before you find out who opened the door, drop a comment below, type 12 if you're still here. It takes 2 seconds. It means everything to me. Note some details ahead are shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. But if you're staying, keep reading. The 14th of November arrived cold and clear, the kind of Charleston morning that makes the city look like a watercolor painting, all pale gold light and white church steeples against a pewter sky. I know what happened that day, not because I was there to see it, but because Dorothy told me every detail afterward, and because I watched the footage myself that night. Sitting at the small desk in the Rutledge apartment with a cup of tea going cold beside me, I will tell it to you the way it was told to me. Arthur had invited Chloe to come back with him. This was in retrospect. The decision of a man who believed he was returning to a completed plan, who wanted the woman he had spent 4 years and nearly $200,000 pursuing to be present, when his life reorganized itself into the shape he had designed for it. He had presented it to her somewhere over the Atlantic as a chance to see Charleston properly. She had agreed. She was by all accounts wearing the diamond pendant necklace when they landed. The taxi turned onto King Street at 3:30 in the afternoon. Arthur was mid-sentence explaining something about antebellum architecture to Chloe, the particular angle of the roof lines, the ironwork on the fence posts, the details that distinguished genuine antebellum construction from the imitations built after the war. The camera above the front gate caught the taxi as it slowed. It caught Arthur leaning forward in the back seat, the sentence dying in his mouth. There was a temporary sign mounted beside the front gate. Clean white letters on navy background, Harrison and Associates Property Settlement Office by appointment. The taxi stopped. Arthur got out. The 12 cartons were stacked in 2 rows on the sidewalk, each one sealed with brown packing tape and labeled in the precise handwriting of Harrison's paralegal Arthur Whitfield personal effects, his academic robes, his faculty award plaques, the bourbon glasses from his study, 3 boxes of books with his annotations in the margins, his teaching prizes wrapped in newspaper. Harrison's office had sent certified notification to Arthur's university email and his departmental mailbox 10 days prior, formal notice of property transfer and request to collect personal belongings by the 14th. Arthur had not responded. He had been in Santorini and then Paris, and he had not apparently considered the administrative correspondence of his own home to be worth attending to. Arthur tried his key. The cash sale had closed in 8 days, expedited clean no contingencies, exactly as Harrison had arranged. He tried it twice. Then he stood with the key in his hand and looked at the door. Behind him, Chloe had stepped out of the taxi. She was looking at the cartons on the sidewalk. She looked at them for a long moment, reading the label on the nearest one. Then she said very quietly, "Arthur, is that your name on those boxes?" The camera did not record sound, but I have watched that footage enough times to have learned to read the particular quality of a person's stillness, and what Arthur's body did in the 3 seconds after Chloe spoke was not the stillness of a man thinking. It was the stillness of a man whose architecture has just collapsed inward and who has not yet processed what the rubble looks like. The front door opened from the inside. Dorothy stood in the doorway in a navy wool sweater, her white hair cut close her hands at her sides. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent 31 years building a life after this man, and who had arrived at a place of such complete equilibrium that nothing he could do or say would disturb it. "Hello, Arthur," she said. Her voice was the voice of someone commenting on the weather. "It's been a long time." He stared at her. The camera caught his face, the sequence of recognitions moving across it like weather across open water. Confusion first, then identification. Then something that the footage was too distant to name precisely, but which Dorothy later described to me as the look of a man watching 30 years of careful construction fall through the floor. Dorothy. His voice, when it came, was barely audible on the recording. How did you, "This is my house now," she said with the mild patience of someone explaining something to a person who is having difficulty following the conversation. "Martha sold it to me last week. Mr. Harrison's associate is inside if you'd like to sign the occupancy transfer confirmation. It won't take long." She waited. Chloe was standing on the sidewalk between Arthur and the cartons, looking from one face to the other with the expression of a person who has just realized she is in the middle of a story whose beginning she was never told. Arthur turned to look at her. The footage shows him turn. It shows him open his mouth. It shows him close it again. For the first time in the 4 years Chloe Warren had known Arthur Whitfield, he had nothing to say. He called Martha's number at 3:47. The call went to voicemail. He tried twice more in the following 10 minutes. He called the number for Harrison's office and was told by a paralegal that all legal matters related to the King Street property should be directed to Harrison and Associates in writing. He called Gary 4 times between 4 o'clock and 4:30. Gary did not answer. Gary had not been reachable for 11 days, which Arthur would have known if he had been paying the kind of attention to his brother that a man should pay when his brother has gambling debts of $340,000 and creditors who are not patient people. At 4:43, the camera above the front gate recorded Arthur Whitfield sitting down on one of his own cartons on the sidewalk of King Street, his good coat bunched at the elbows, his carry-on bag beside him on the pavement. He sat there for 19 minutes. Chloe stood nearby for the first 4. Then she took her own bag from beside the taxi, said something to him that the camera did not capture, and walked toward the corner of King and Broad without looking back. Dorothy told me all of this later over the phone in the same unhurried tone she used for everything. "He looks small," she said. "For the first time since I've known him. Actually small." I told her I was sorry she'd had to witness it. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm not," she said. November 15th. I chose a dark navy wool dress, that morning modest professional, the kind of garment a faculty wife wears to a university event. I had been a faculty wife for 30 years. I knew exactly how to dress for the role. I arrived at Whitmore University's Founders Hall at 6:15, 45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and chose a seat in the 3rd row from the back. The screen had been live since 6 o'clock. I did not watch it go on. I was already inside, already seated, already reading the printed program with the careful attention of a woman who has nothing in particular to look at. But I knew what was playing on the corner of College and Glebe. From the moment I heard the first knot of arriving guests pause outside the main entrance, and from the particular quality of silence that followed the pause, Charleston Event Displays had built the content reel to run on a 12-minute loop. The screen was running exactly as prepared, the 3 segments cycling in sequence, each one a plain document, each one factually unimpeachable. No narration, no music, no editorializing. Just the truth presented on a public sidewalk to anyone who cared to stop and read it. The 3rd segment, 2 columns of numbers. On the left, Arthur Whitfield's publicly listed faculty salary. On the right, the monthly household allowance he had provided to his wife of 30 years, $800. The columns sat beside each other for 15 seconds before the loop returned to the beginning. By 6:20, the guests filing through the main gate were moving more slowly than guests usually move when entering a celebration. Inside the hall filled with the particular energy of 400 people, who have each independently learned something they are not yet sure how to discuss with the person beside them. I had attended enough faculty events to recognize the difference between the murmur of anticipation and the murmur of discomfort. This was the latter. Arthur arrived at 6:40. He looked the way a man looks when he has slept badly in a hotel room after the worst day of his life and has decided through sheer force of professional habit to appear as though he has not. His tie was straight. His suit was pressed. He walked to his reserved seat in the front row with the bearing of someone daring the room to acknowledge what was happening outside. I watched him from the 3rd row from the back. He did not look toward the rear of the hall. The ceremony began on schedule. Provost Davis welcomed the guests, acknowledged the Board of Trustees, thanked the donors. His voice was even practiced carrying no detectable weight beyond the ordinary weight of academic ceremony. Whatever he was managing internally, he had decided the room would not see it yet. When Arthur's name was called, he stood and walked to the stage. He accepted the framed citation and the arrangement of white flowers. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the assembled guests' colleagues of 20 years, former students, administrators, the local press seated along the left wall, and he began. 30 years of service, he said, to this institution, to this discipline, to the values of academic integrity of mentorship. The Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs stepped onto the stage from the left wing. He moved quietly without urgency the way people move when they have been instructed to avoid the appearance of a scene. He placed a hand on Arthur's arm, not firmly just present, and leaned toward the microphone. "Professor Whitfield, I apologize for the interruption. Provost Davis needs to speak with you immediately. There is a matter before the Faculty Ethics Committee that requires your attention." The hall went completely silent. Arthur did not move for a moment. He looked at the associate provost. He looked at the citation in his hands. He looked out at the room, and I watched his eyes track across the rows of faces, reading the expressions, reading the quality of the silence, reading 400 people who had all walked past the same screen on the way in. He set the citation on the podium. He walked off the stage. Provost Davis stepped to the microphone. "We'll take a brief recess while we address an administrative matter. Please help yourself to refreshments in the atrium." The corridor behind the stage ran along the east wall of the building, its windows facing College Street. I learned afterward from Sarah, who had spoken with Harrison's paralegal, that Arthur stopped at the second window. The screen was visible from there. 15 feet wide, 8 feet tall, cycling through its 12-minute loop on the public sidewalk 40 yards away. The message thread segment was playing when he reached the window. His own name at the top of the exchange, Gary's below. The final frame holding on the screen for its full 15 seconds. Just make sure it's clean. When Arthur came back through the hall toward the main exit, I was already standing. He was moving quickly now, the composed faculty bearing "finally abandoned," replaced by something more fundamental, a man trying to locate a point of exit in a room that had contracted around him. His eyes swept the hall. They found me. I was in the third row from the back coat already over my arm, standing still. I looked at him the way you look at something you have finished being afraid of directly, without particular feeling the way you look at a fact. He stopped. We looked at each other across the length of the hall for perhaps 3 seconds. Then I turned, walked to the door, and pushed it open. The November air outside was cold and clean. Behind me, through the heavy wooden doors, I could hear the sound of 400 people attempting to process what had just happened. Ahead of me at the corner of College and Glebe, the screen was still running. I did not stop to watch it. I had already seen everything I needed to see, not on the screen. But on Arthur Whitfield's face in the moment, he finally understood that the woman he had spent 30 years dismissing had been paying attention the entire time. Sarah was waiting by the car. She handed me a coffee, hot a little milk, no sugar. She had remembered. We drove away without speaking. There was nothing left to say that the evening had not already said. But my phone was lit with incoming notifications, and I knew watching the screen pulse in my coat pocket that the night was far from over for Arthur. In the 3 days after the ceremony, I watched from a careful distance as the life Arthur Whitfield had spent 30 years constructing, the professional reputation, the managed image, the 4-year architecture of deception, came apart the way poorly built things always do, faster than anyone expects, and all at once. I was not there for any of it directly. Sarah called. Harrison's office sent updates. I sat in the apartment on Rutledge Avenue with a yellow legal pad and took notes the way I used to take notes in client meetings. Because writing things down is how I have always made sense of information I cannot yet fully process. Whitmore University moved quickly. On the 16th, the Faculty Ethics Committee issued its preliminary finding. Professor Arthur Whitfield was suspended with pay effective, immediately pending full investigation. The language in the official notice which Harrison's office obtained through standard legal channels cited 3 separate grounds: a relationship with a former advisee within the prohibited, 5-year post-graduation period misrepresentation of travel expenses as grant-funded research activity, and conduct unbecoming a faculty member of the university. On the 20th, 4 days later, the suspension became termination. 25 years of faculty service, the name professorship he had spent a decade accumulating the credentials to justify, the pension that had been building since 1999. All of it subject to forfeiture review under the university's ethics policy, which Harrison had pulled and read and summarized for me in 2 sentences. Institutions can claw back pension benefits when termination results from deliberate ethical violations. Whitmore's policy is explicit on this point. Arthur Whitfield had walked into that institution in 1999 as an ambitious assistant professor with a good publication record and a talent for making people feel that being in his presence was a privilege. He walked out of it on the 20th of November with a termination letter and no forwarding address for his office mail. Chloe Warren called him on the 17th. I know this because Arthur's attorney, whom he had retained by that point, later disclosed it in the course of proceedings. The call lasted 6 minutes. She told him that what had happened was not what Gary had described to her when she had agreed to the arrangement 4 years earlier. She told him she was finished. She left a note at the hotel front desk before she checked out. Harrison's investigator, who had been maintaining discreet observation, documented it. 3 sentences handwritten. I'm sorry, Arthur. This was never personal. I hope you understand that eventually. Arthur did not understand it immediately. That much was evident from what followed. What he understood in the days after that call was the shape of what Gary had actually constructed, not a plan to help his brother manage a financial problem, but a mechanism to extract from Arthur everything Gary needed using Chloe as the lever and Arthur's own vanity as the fulcrum. The affair had never been Arthur's discovery. It had been Gary's design. And Arthur, the careful professor who had spent 4 years believing he was the architect of his own parallel life, had been the raw material all along. The financial picture that emerged through Harrison's office in those same days was a specific kind of ruin. The $183,000 drawn from the joint account was gone spent across 3 years on hotels, flights, dinners, and the maintenance of a life Arthur had been running in parallel. That money was documented traceable and constituted dissipation of marital assets that the court would eventually address. But the deeper problem was the $380,000 Arthur had borrowed from Palmetto Lending Group, a private lending institution, operating at 18% annual. Interest the loan registered in Arthur's name alone, secured against his projected faculty income. Projected income he no longer had. The total outstanding debt, with 6 months of compounding interest already accumulated, was $412,000. He had also, at Gary's request, co-signed guarantees on 2 of Gary's private loans, a fact Gary had buried in paperwork Arthur signed without reading. In the same confident manner Arthur had used when handing Martha documents he expected her not to read. The irony was not lost on me when Harrison described it. Gary had left Charleston. Linda had left before him. The creditors who had been pursuing Gary were now looking at Arthur, who had assets on paper and no ability to liquidate them. Arthur came to Harrison's office on the 18th without an appointment. Harrison's paralegal called me afterward. She described him as composed on the surface and not composed underneath the specific combination that produces unpredictable behavior in people who have spent their lives relying on the performance of composure. He told Harrison he intended to sue Martha for dissipation of marital assets. Harrison placed 3 documents on the desk. The deed of gift dated March 14, 2014, bearing Arthur's own signature. The bank statements showing $480,000 transferred to Chloe Warren across 4 years from accounts in Arthur's name. And the mortgage application submitted to Palmetto Private Finance containing the signature that was not Martha's. Mr. Whitfield, Harrison said, the house was your wife's separate property. She had every legal right to sell it without your consent. As for dissipation of marital assets, the $480,000 you directed to Ms. Warren is a considerably more pressing example of that claim. I'd suggest consulting your own attorney. Arthur left without responding. Sarah called that evening after 9. Martha. Her voice had the careful quality it used when she was delivering information she wanted me to hear clearly. Charleston PD called Harrison's office today. They're opening a criminal investigation into the mortgage documents submitted to Palmetto Private Finance. The application contains a forged signature yours. Arthur submitted that application before Harrison's letter stopped the transaction. The forgery was complete when the document was filed. Under South Carolina law and federal statute, that's a felony. I sat with that for a long time. A felony, not just a divorce. Not just an asset settlement negotiated between attorneys in a conference room. A criminal charge, the kind that carries handcuffs and a trial date and a sentence measured in years. I had not set out to send Arthur Whitfield to prison. I had set out to protect what was mine. But the law, it turned out, had its own momentum. And Arthur, after 30 years of careful maneuvering, had finally run out of room to maneuver in. He had built the trap himself. I had simply declined to walk into it. Courtroom 4 of the Charleston County Family Court smelled of old paper central heating and a faint administrative quality I can only describe as the smell of endings. I had been in that building twice before, once for my mother's estate, once to notarize the original deed on the King Street house. The third time, I was there to end my marriage. Harrison met me in the lobby at 8:45. He was carrying a leather document case I recognized from every meeting we had held since October, and he looked the way he always looked, unhurried, prepared, faintly amused by the idea that the outcome of the morning was anything other than settled. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready since September," I told him. The civil proceeding was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Arthur arrived with his attorney, a younger man I did not recognize, which told me something about the quality of legal representation Arthur could currently afford, and took the table to the left. I sat to the right. We did not look at each other. Harrison presented the case in the methodical sequence I had watched him build across 3 months, the documented adultery, supported by the investigator's photographs and the email recovered from the tablet, the dissipation of marital assets, evidenced by the $480,000 transferred to Chloe Warren across 4 years from accounts Arthur controlled, and the forged signature on the mortgage application, submitted to Palmetto Private Finance, submitted as evidence of the deliberate nature of Arthur's conduct throughout the marriage. Arthur's attorney made the argument I had expected him to make, that the King Street property, regardless of its original title status, had functioned as the marital home for 30 years and should be treated as marital property subject to equitable distribution. Harrison set the deed of gift on the table. The document was 4 pages notarized, bearing the embossed seal of Harrington and Associates, Notarial Services, Charleston, South Carolina, dated the 14th of March, 2014. At the bottom of the final page in the cramped cursive, I had recognized the night I found it in the tin box Arthur Whitfield's signature. Arthur's attorney picked it up. He read the first page. He read the second. He set it down and looked at Harrison. Then he looked at the table. He had nothing to say to it. There was nothing to say. The document was Arthur's own instrument, executed by his own hand, witnessed and certified, and irrevocable under the laws of the state of South Carolina. Whatever argument existed about the marital character of the house, Arthur had answered it himself a decade ago for reasons that had nothing to do with generosity. Judge Reeves had the bearing of a woman who has heard every variation of human failing that passes through a family court and has long since made her peace with the fact that wisdom arrives, for most people at considerable expense. She reviewed the submissions. She asked Harrison 2 clarifying questions about the timeline of the property transfer. She asked Arthur's attorney whether he had any additional documentation to support the marital property claim. He did not. Her rulings were delivered in the flat sequential tone of someone reading items from a list. The divorce was granted on grounds of adultery and constructive abandonment under South Carolina Code Section 20-3-10. The King Street property was confirmed as separate property of Martha Hargrove, the sale to Dorothy Caldwell recognized as valid and binding. Arthur Whitfield was ordered to restore $480,000 to the marital estate, a judgment that would stand on paper against a man who no longer had the assets to satisfy it. No alimony was awarded to either party. Martha had professional qualifications and independent income. Arthur had neither currently in any meaningful sense. Court costs and legal fees for both parties were assigned to Arthur Whitfield. The whole of it took 40 minutes. The criminal arraignment was in a different courtroom on a different floor, scheduled for 2 o'clock. I sat in the gallery. Harrison sat beside me. Arthur came in with the same attorney who now had the look of a man calculating whether this case was going to cost him more than it was worth. The prosecutor for the state of South Carolina read the charges in the careful monotone that prosecutors use when they want the weight of language to carry the work. 1 count of forgery of a legal instrument, a felony under South Carolina Code, Section 1613-10. The instrument in question, a mortgage application submitted to Palmetto Private Finance, bearing a signature purporting to be that of Martha Hargrove, the property owner of record. executed without her knowledge or consent in connection with a proposed loan of $950,000. One count, one document, potentially 10 years. When the charges were read, Arthur looked across the gallery. He found me in the third row. His face in that moment had none of the faculty composure, none of the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the authority in every room. He looked the way people look when they finally understand that the story they told themselves about a situation was not the story that was actually happening. He looked frightened. His attorney requested a continuance. The judge scheduled the trial for the second week of January 2025. Arthur was released on his own recognizance, which is what the court does when the accused has no prior record, no flight risk profile, and nothing left to run with. As I stood to leave, Arthur said my name. Martha. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not anger, not the confident authority of a man managing a room, but something smaller. Please, we can still talk about this. I stopped for one beat. I did not turn around. Then I walked out. In the hallway, December light came through the tall windows and fell in pale rectangles across the marble floor. Harrison shook my hand. "The civil matter is resolved," he said. "The criminal case now belongs to the state. It's no longer your burden to carry." "I know," I said. "That's exactly how it should be." Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I understood that for the first time in months, I had no plan to make, no next step to prepare, no document to review, no filing to authorize, no evidence to preserve. The machinery I had set in motion was running on its own, now tended by people whose profession it was to tend such things. Arthur Whitfield's fate was no longer in my hands. It was in the hands of the state of South Carolina, and they, unlike me, were not inclined to be lenient. January 17th, 2025. Arthur Malcolm Whitfield entered a guilty plea on the 14th, his attorney facing the USB evidence and the civil court record already entered against him, had advised there was nothing to contest. The sentencing hearing followed 3 days later. 3 years in the South Carolina Department of Corrections required to serve no less than 85% before any parole consideration for the felony forgery of a legal instrument valued in excess of $500,000. I was not in the courtroom. I was sitting at a table in a coffee shop on King Street, a building with a different tenant now. A different life behind its windows, drinking an Americano with a little milk and no sugar when Sarah's message came through. 3 years, 85% minimum, just handed down. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the street. The sentencing had taken 40 minutes, according to Sarah, who had been present in the gallery. The judge had cited 3 factors in determining the sentence: the deliberate and premeditated nature of the forgery, the magnitude of the financial instrument involved, and the evidence of a 4-year pattern of deception that the civil proceedings had already established in the public record. Arthur had made a statement before sentencing something about 30 years of service to education about context and complexity, about the pressures a man faces when the people he loves make demands he cannot meet. The judge had listened without expression. Then she had sentenced him, 3 years. No early release. The South Carolina Department of Education would initiate proceedings to permanently revoke his teaching credentials upon conviction. His remaining assets, a retirement account, a small investment portfolio, a storage unit in North Charleston containing the contents of 12 cartons from a King Street sidewalk would be subject to execution proceedings to satisfy the $480,000 civil judgment. After legal fees, Arthur's net worth would be approximately what it had been when he arrived at Whitmore University in 1999 as a new assistant professor. Nothing much, and the need to start from scratch. The Palmetto Lending Group debt of $412,000 bearing interest at 18% annually would be waiting for him when he was released. The others resolved themselves with the particular quiet efficiency of things that have simply run out of road. Gary filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in December, which is the kind that liquidates rather than restructures the kind you file when there is nothing worth restructuring. He lost the house in Mount Pleasant he had been renting under a name that turned out to be his wife's cousin's. He lost the car. The creditors who had been pressing him for 3 years received fractions of what they were owed and wrote off the remainder. The plan he had spent 4 years constructing the seizure of the King Street property. The extraction of $950,000 from his brother's marriage produced nothing for him except a bankruptcy filing and an address he no longer lived at. A criminal warrant had been issued in his name by the Charleston County Sheriff's Office in connection with the forgery conspiracy, but Gary was no longer in South Carolina, and no one who knew him was saying where he had gone. Chloe Warren left Charleston on the 17th of November, the day she checked out of her hotel. Sarah heard through legal channels that certain creditors associated with Gary's network were attempting to locate her in connection with transactions Gary had apparently conducted in her name, without her full knowledge. Whether she had understood the full scope of what Gary had done when she agreed to his arrangement 4 years earlier was a question that would belong eventually to whatever court caught up with her. It was not a question I spent time on. Linda had been gone since before Arthur's arrest. No forwarding address. I did not look for one. Dorothy called me on a Thursday in January, 2 days after the sentencing. She had been in the King Street house for 6 weeks by then. She told me she had torn out the carpet in the upstairs hallway. It had been the wrong color, she said, for 30 years, and she had always known it, and that she was repainting the kitchen in a shade called Savannah Morning, which was approximately the color of the light that came through her Forsyth Park apartment windows on a clear day. She asked how I was. I told her I was fine and meant it in the way I had not meant it for a very long time. We talked for 40 minutes. It felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. Daniel and Claire came to the Rutledge apartment on a Saturday evening in late January, the first dinner that had been only the 3 of us in a space that was only mine, at a table that fit exactly the number of people who were supposed to be there. The apartment was small. The table was small. I made soup from my mother's recipe, a low-country she-crab soup she had made every winter of my childhood, the kind that takes 3 hours and is worth every minute of it. The kitchen smelled the way kitchens are supposed to smell. The 3 of us ate without hurrying. We did not talk much about Arthur. Daniel had spoken to him once briefly through his attorney and had said what he needed to say. Claire had not spoken to him yet, and I did not press her. They were managing what they needed to manage in the order they needed to manage it. That was theirs to do. After dinner, Claire reached into the canvas bag she had brought and set something on the table between us. It was a sheet of drafting paper, pale with age, folded into quarters. I recognized it before she unfolded it. I had not looked at it closely when I found it in the tin box, but the size and the quality of the paper were the things my hands remembered. She unfolded it carefully the way you handle something that has been waiting a long time to be useful. A site plan. My handwriting in the margins dated 1999. A community garden proposal for a parcel in downtown Charleston antebellum design language. A reading garden, a children's section, an aromatic herb border along the south wall. 32, and drawn with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned to put her ideas away because someone else found them inconvenient. "Mom," Claire said, "is this what I think it is?" I looked at the drawing for a moment, then at Daniel, then at Claire. "I drew that in 1999, I said. I put it away because Arthur told me there was no market for community projects and I should focus on private clients." The table was quiet. I said, "It's time to take it out of the box." Claire lifted the drawing with both hands, holding it at the corners. Daniel leaned forward and looked at it the way a structural engineer looks at a plan, not with sentiment, but with the focused attention of someone assessing whether a thing can actually be built. "Mom," Claire said, "you should build this." Daniel nodded. I looked at the faded pencil lines, the garden I had imagined when I was 32 years old, and still believed that the things I wanted to make were worth making. 30 years of experience. Everything I had learned about how to make a space become something that mattered. All of it still mine. No one had taken any of it. It had simply been waiting in a box. Spring comes to Charleston in a rush, not gradually the way it arrives in other places, but all at once, as if the city has been holding its breath and suddenly lets go. One March morning, you wake up and the magnolias have opened overnight. The air carries wisteria, and everything that looked gray and bare 2 weeks ago has turned an irreversible green. I signed the incorporation papers for Hargrove Landscape Design, LLC on the first Monday of March 2025. My name. Only my name on the line that said owner. The notary stamped the documents with the same unhurried efficiency as every other important piece of paper in my life. I thanked her, walked out into the March morning, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the copies in my hand. 33 years since the last time I'd incorporated a company. The feeling was remarkably similar. The office on Broad Street was small, perhaps 300 square feet, a single room with 2 windows facing the street, a pine work table I bought from an estate sale in Mount Pleasant, and a Boston fern in the corner that I purchased because my mother always had one, and because I had spent long enough in rooms decorated to impress rather than to inhabit. The lease was month to month. Everything was provisional in the good sense, nothing locked in that did not need to be. Maya Thorne started on a Wednesday. She was 24, recently graduated from Clemson's landscape architecture program, and possessed of the particular quality I have always looked for in young practitioners. She asked questions before she made assumptions. She had sent her portfolio to 3 firms in Charleston and received 1 response, mine, which I had drafted at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night after her application landed in my inbox, and I read through her thesis project twice. A native plant restoration design for a degraded coastal site near Beaufort. Methodical research, honest drawing, and instinct for how plants behave over time rather than just how they look at installation. I called her the next morning and offered her the position before she had sat down. The call from the Historic Charleston Foundation came on a Thursday in the second week of March. They were undertaking a restoration of the Nathaniel Russell House Gardens, the federal period estate on Meeting Street built in 1808. Its grounds a rare surviving example of early 19th century formal garden design in the Low Country. They had reviewed 3 proposals. They wanted to discuss mine. I had not submitted a proposal. I told them this. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then, we found your name through the Historic Charleston Preservation Society membership records. There's an unpublished research paper in their archive, a study of the Russell Gardens' original plant palette and spatial organization written about 15 years ago. Is that yours? It was. I had written it over the course of 2 winters, working from historical records, estate inventories, and period horticultural catalogs, as something between a hobby and an act of faith that the work would eventually matter to someone. Arthur had asked once what I was spending so many evenings on. I had said research. He had not asked again. I told the foundation representative I would come in the following Monday. Dorothy called that same afternoon. She had been in the King Street house for 4 months by then, and the transformation she was making to it was by all accounts as thorough and unhurried as Dorothy herself. "Come see what I've done to the east wall," she said. I drove over on Saturday morning. The house looked different from the street in a way I could not immediately name, and then I understood it looked inhabited. Not maintained the way it had been maintained during my years there, but genuinely lived in the way a house looks when the person inside it is exactly where they mean to be. Dorothy met me at the front door and walked me through. The hallway carpet was gone, replaced by painted wood floors, the color of pale honey. The kitchen was Savannah morning, a warm cream with a faint gold undertone that caught the morning light in a way that made the room feel entirely different from the room I had cooked in for 30 years. The east garden wall had a new climbing rose trained along it, a coral variety I didn't recognize just beginning to bud. "Does it feel strange?" Dorothy asked. "Being here." I looked around the garden, the camellias I had planted, the boxwood I had shaped for 2 decades, the water oak whose roots I had worked around every spring. "Less than I expected," I said. "You've changed the east wall. The rose reads better this way." She looked at me with the expression of someone who has decided to like a person and is finding the decision confirmed. "I want to hire you," she said, "for the garden." "I'd be honored," I said. We had tea on the piazza after that, the 2 of us in the garden that she had bought from me that I had tended for 30 years. that had once belonged to a man who had tried to take it from both of us. Neither of us mentioned him. There was nothing about him that the afternoon required. Sarah called on the drive home. A national landscape design journal had contacted her. Someone had forwarded them the foundation announcement about the Russell Garden project, and they wanted to profile Hargrove landscape design. "Architect begins again at 57, she said. "That's the angle they're pitching." "Tell them I'll think about it," I said. The restoration survey began the following week. Maya and I spent an afternoon at the Russell house with measuring tape and sketchbooks moving through the garden spaces, while the March light came low and golden through the live oaks. Maya was drawing a section of the north parterre when she looked up. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "how do you know this garden so well if you've never worked here before?" I looked at the 200-year-old camellia in the corner, its bark the color of aged iron, its form shaped by decades of careful hand, at the boxwood parterre that had survived multiple owners, multiple decades, multiple people who had not known what they had. "I studied it for 15 years, I said. "I simply didn't have permission to begin until now." Walking home that evening, I passed the corner of College and Glebe. The event company had collected their equipment months ago. The pavement was ordinary, unmarked, carrying no evidence of what had stood there in November, as if nothing had ever happened there, as if everything had. I smiled and kept walking. May in Charleston. The Nathaniel Russell Garden restoration took 4 months longer than I had projected, because halfway through Maya's trowel caught on something that turned out to be an edge of brick, and the edge of brick turned out to be a section of an original 18th century pathway that had been buried under 60 years of accumulated topsoil and well-intentioned maintenance. I stopped the work for 3 days while a preservation specialist came out from Columbia to assess it. We rerouted the drainage plan entirely. Some things deserve to be brought back slowly, carefully, in the right light. The restoration completed on a Thursday afternoon in late May. The formal opening was the following Saturday. The historic Charleston Foundation set up chairs in the north garden beneath the live oaks, where the shade came in clean and cool even in late morning. There were perhaps 40 people, board members, preservation staff, local press, a representative from the National Trust. Maya stood near the south wall, looking at the boxwood parterre with the expression of someone who has just understood for the first time in a practical sense what it means to restore something rather than simply design it. The foundation president spoke briefly. He said that the restoration represented not only horticultural excellence, but a deep understanding of what Charleston's historic gardens had meant to the people who built them spaces of intention, of care, of permanence in uncertain times. I stood at the edge of the gathering and listened. He had no idea he was describing the past 8 months of my life. Dorothy arrived just before the remarks ended. She found me near the camellia border and stood beside me without preamble, looking at the garden with the expression she used when she was taking something in seriously. "It's extraordinary," she said. "It was always here," I told her. "It just needed someone to remove what was covering it." She looked at me sideways. "I think that applies to more than just the garden." We stood together for a while after that, watching the guests move through the restored paths, the 18th century brickwork now visible and protected beneath a low border of native sedge, 2 women in a garden that had outlasted everything that had tried to diminish it. Neither of us said anything more. There was nothing more to say. Daniel and Claire arrived together. Daniel photographed the garden with the methodical attention of a structural engineer, documenting something he wants to understand fully. "For the Hargrove design portfolio," he said, which made me smile in a way I felt all the way down. Claire stood next to me for a long time without speaking. Then, "You look like yourself again, Mom." I said, "I look more like myself than I ever have." The guests left gradually, the way people leave afternoon events when they have nowhere urgent to be, in small groups, pausing at the gate, looking back once before they go. By 5 o'clock, the garden was quiet. Maya packed up the documentation materials and said goodbye with the careful professionalism of someone who is learning that endings are also a kind of skill. I told her she had done exceptional work. I meant it completely. Sarah squeezed my hand before she left and did not say anything, which was the most Sarah thing she could have done. Then the garden was just mine for a few minutes in the late afternoon light. I sat on the stone bench at the far end of the south walk where the light comes through the branches of the old live oak at the angle it only reaches in May, when the sun is high enough and the leaves are new enough. I reached into my jacket pocket. The rose was dry and flat, pressed between the pages of a small book I had carried since October. A pale yellow variety grafted from a cutting a woman at the Plant Society had given me years ago. I had cut it from the east trellis on the last day I was in the King Street house, wrapped it in a damp paper towel, driven away, and not looked back. I set it on the ground between two of the old garden roses where the soil was loose and dark, not as a memorial, not as a letting go in the dramatic sense that phrase is usually meant, simply as the completion of a thing that had been in process for a long time. I thought about Arthur not with anger, not with the particular exhausted grief that had lived in my chest for months, but with the flat clarity of someone who has finished an account and closed the ledger. He was a chapter. He had shaped me in ways I was still discovering. He was not part of what I was building. I opened the small notebook I had been carrying since Sarah told me about the magazine profile. The page was blank. I uncapped my pen. I wrote, "I am 57 years old." I started over. Here is what I know now. I am 57 years old. I have a small company, a small apartment, and 2 children who know exactly who their mother is. I do not have the mansion on King Street. I cannot recover 30 years. But I have something I did not know I had lost until I found it again. I have my own name in my own handwriting on a document that no one else can touch. And I have a garden that will outlast all of us. It turns out that is more than enough. Someone once told me that God places the answers in front of us long before we are ready to read them. The bank statements had sat in that drawer for 11 months. I was the one who chose not to look. That is the lesson I carry now, not bitterness, not triumph, just clarity. This is a family drama story I lived without fully understanding I was living it. And if you take one thing from my experience, let it be this: do not do what I did. Do not mistake silence for safety. Do not confuse a quiet house with a happy marriage. Ask the questions that feel too uncomfortable to ask, because the answers will find you either way on your terms or on someone else's. Among all the family revenge stories I had ever heard, I never believed mine would become one. I am 57 years old. I started a landscape architecture firm. I restored a historic garden. I sold a house to a woman who deserved it more than I ever admitted. These are not acts of revenge, they are acts of reclamation. And yet the world will call them family revenge stories, and perhaps that is not entirely wrong. My personal opinion, offered plainly, a marriage that requires one person's permanent ignorance is not a partnership. It is a contract with fine print you were never shown. This family drama story does not end in fire. It ends in a garden in May with good soil and a name on a door that belongs only to me. If that sounds like justice, I will accept the word. This is the final chapter of a family drama story I am proud to have survived. And if these family revenge stories teach anything at all, let them teach you this: the most dangerous document in a marriage is the bank statement you never opened. Did this story speak to you? Leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories told with honesty, depth, and quiet courage. Thank you for staying until the very last line. The stories ahead may contain some fictional elements constructed purely for educational and reflective purposes. If this content is not right for you at this moment, that is perfectly fine. Step away gently and find something that suits you better. Your presence here, even for just a single visit, is always appreciated.
Alright, that's everything for today. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next time.